Christopher Hitchens is an English-born, Oxford-educated writer and journalist who has lived and worked in Washington for many years. He is well known for his wit, his sharp arguments, and strong opinions on religion, politics, and especially the war in Iraq. David Brooks of the New York Times says there are few people in this country who bring such a literary perspective to political and policy controversies. And here is what his friend Martin Amos said on this program this week.
When we met, it was a sort of like the lightning stroke.
Really?
Yeah. It was, I mean, I thought, here's someone who knows exactly what I think and feel about everything, and I think he thinks that about me too, as if our sensibilities and our minds were somehow interchangeable. But a romantic friendship from the start.
Also, here are some excerpts from his appearances on our program.
It's not for everybody. Not everyone wants to always be an awkward cuss or out of step or against the stream. But if you do feel that the consensus doesn't speak for you, if there's something about you that makes you feel that it would be worth being unpopular or marginal for the chance to lead your own life and have a life instead of a career or a job, then I can promise you it is worthwhile, yeah. Half the time when I was arguing with the so-called anti-war movement, they would say their reason for opposing the war was that if it began, Saddam Hussein would obliterate huge numbers of Americans and Israelis and neighboring countries by his weapons of mass destruction. That was their case for peace, that he had the weapons. So now, in other words, people have to take part in their own deception. The worship of non-existent entities, the attempt to derive morality from the supernatural. All of that is more, I think, than mistaken or irritating. It's becoming actually very menacing now. The people who think they have permission of that sort from the heavens are trying to kill us. Or sometimes more mildly insisting that our children be taught nonsense in schools, or telling us that AIDS may be bad in Africa but condoms are much worse, or stem cell research shouldn't be done. But wherever you turn, if you find this a barbaric foe, you'll find that this person is giving himself religious permission. Yeah.
In June, Christopher Hitchens published his 11th book, a memoir called Hitch 22. It traces his life and coming of age as a young man and an intellectual. In the midst of a promotional tour for his memoir, doctors discovered that he has cancer of the esophagus. He canceled all engagement and is undergoing chemotherapy and other treatments. In a brilliant column in Vanity Fair's September issue, Hitchens describes the experience as, quote, taking me from the country of the well across the stark frontier that marks off the land of malady. I spoke with Chris Hitchens in Washington at his apartment early this week. Here is that conversation about his journey. You have lived a certain kind of life.
Yes.
Engaged by alcohol, cigarettes, sex, politics, ideas, books.
Yes, I think I've been very lucky in that way. And I think it's, I'm sure it's Yeats who says you have to, in effect, choose between the life and the work. You can be happy in the one or the other. There is a way of finessing that, I like to think, which is if your work really is your life, and that things like friendship and language and travel and bohemia are also the work, then you really are lucky, because there's no real separation between the two.
When did you know this is what you wanted to do?
Oh, when I was very small, I realized that I wanted to write, at any rate. I didn't know that I'd be so lucky with it, but I knew there was nothing else I could do.
But this was before Oxford.
Oh, yeah. It was the earliest decision I made. I mean, I don't know what it's like to say, have a vocation or something of this sort. I'm sure people do. They know they want to be a doctor, for example. And I sure knew I couldn't do that, or any of the things my mother wanted me to do, like be a lawyer. I wasn't fit for any other kind of work, so that helped to make up my mind. I just knew I wanted to write. And incidentally, around the same time, I also had the very strong feeling I wanted to move to the United States. And I couldn't have explained either of these two things very well. But I now realize, and the book taught me, that the two impulses were the same, that really to mature as a writer, I had to leave England and come here.
Surely you're not suggesting you can't reach maturity as a writer without coming here. It only applied to you.
Only to me, yes. Somehow.
What was that about?
I can't be sure. I still don't really know. But it was something to do with the scope of America, certainly, and the relative the relatively limited character of English society, comparatively at any rate.
In class structure and everything else?
Things like that, and also I think
More of a meritocracy.
if you show any promise as a writer in Britain, in London, that's fine, and people will give you work and so forth, but you keep feeling all the time you're having to pass through a series of tests and hoops, he's quite promising and so forth. You can die of that kind of encouragement. Whereas in America, if you're willing to take the chance and say, look, here I am, try this, people can, you don't feel you're having to go through these stages of evolution, maturing in the cask like a fine old vintage that in the end goes sour before it's ripe.
Tell me about your father's influence, called the Commander.
Well, the Commander is the conservative and puritanical influence on my life. He was a very gloomy, pessimistic man who spent his life in the Royal Navy. He once told me that the only time in his life he'd ever felt he knew what he was doing was in the years 1939 to 1945, when he had to fight a very hard and bitter war.
Because there was purpose?
Yes, he understood what his job was and what the motive for it was. And that was a very hard war at sea, largely but not entirely in the North Atlantic, against Hitler. Though, to his disgust, and proving to him that life is unfair, the job that Churchill actually gave him was running guns to Stalin, supplying convoys to the Red Army over the hump of Murmansk, a very arduous job fighting in the Arctic to help out the communists who he'd always hated all his life. So the iron entered into his soul at that point even further than it had before.
He died when?
He died in 1988.
So he knew what you had become, and he knew some of your early revolutionary fervor.
Sure, and he would have still wanted to know when I was going to get a serious job.
You would say.
And when are you going to put down some roots?
Exactly right.
Exactly.
Right.
Well, the old man would have liked me. I must have been a terrible disappointment to him. He would have liked me to be good at games. I couldn't care a damn about sports. I'm no good at them.
Neither observing or playing?
No, not interested. Not good at the things he was good at. He was good at physics and chemistry and math. I'm not good at any of these things. Would rather go off to the library and read a book, that sort of thing. Wasn't a conservative, to say the least of it.
Your extraordinary wife sitting here in this room once said about you that he's a warrior, I'm paraphrasing badly, and that he probably hungered for battle, almost in a Hemingway-esque manner. True?
Well, Dr. Johnson says that every man thinks of himself meanly if he's never been a soldier or never been to sea. And I don't know if that's absolutely true of all males, but something like it is true. And it's certainly true if you're English, born just after the Second World War. Well, all the movies, all the television programs, all the reminiscences are about the finest hour, which you've missed.
Yes.
And in which your father happened to have taken quite a fine part of his own.
Indeed.
You're always going to wonder how you would have shaped up, and you're never really going to find out. So I remember once when I'd been in Lebanon during a period of warfare there, and writing about it for the New Statesman, in fact, I got a phone call from my father, practically unprecedented, saying, A, that he quite liked the article, which amazed me. He was a man of very few words, and none of them praise usually. And second, before he hung up, he said rather gruffly, by the way, I thought it was rather brave of you to go to Beirut. And I was amazed. I thought, I'd never expected praise for courage from the old man. And I wondered if that's what I'd been secretly, covertly wanting all along. I certainly think, and this is what first interested me in the writing of George Orwell, that there's an amazingly interesting symbiosis between people who maybe don't like the empire or the armed services, but who are brought up in that milieu, as Orwell was, and at least they admire the flinty values, the self-sacrifice, the martial virtues, the thrift, the duty, sense of duty and courage and so on that comes with it.
And you?
These are virtues that can be useful in all circumstances.
But you're saying that's you?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Like Orwell, you
I won't say I exemplify them, that would be a laugh, but that I have a respect for them. And it's an interesting thing I noticed the other day.
Including discipline?
Yes, certainly. And the willingness to stick by a conviction, as well.
Churchill, in fact, said, if you've never been shot at and missed, then you've never lived.
Yes. Well, actually, he says there's no sense of exhilaration like the sensation of being shot at without result.
Yes, it is much fun.
And actually, I think I mentioned it in my book because I was once with the great John Burns, who I think is the greatest
War
correspondent of our time.
Bureau chief of the New York Times in London.
He was showing me around Sarajevo. I was very glad to have such a tough and brave guide. And someone did take a shot at us. And I actually felt that thing you read about of the like a hornet going past your ear that close. And you think, wow, I wouldn't want it to be any nearer. And you think, I'm very glad I have a return ticket out of here and so forth. But you then feel, briefly, an amazing sense of exhilaration. It's best not to get hooked on it.
Yeah. Dexter Filkins can talk about the same thing, a kind of, colleague of John Burns.
Yes. I've been to a lot of places where that can happen. And I write in the book about the number of times in Afghanistan and in Beirut and elsewhere where I could have been killed. But what I found out about this was I could no more be a Dexter Filkins or a John Burns than I could be a full-time soldier or sailor. I can do it for a few days, but I don't have the sand that's required to do it regularly and expose oneself to danger professionally. No, I don't have that. But I hugely admire people who do it.
What's your evaluation of Hemingway?
People used to say about Hemingway was that he never got over the fact that he could never be as butch as Gertrude Stein. And you always get the impression with Hemingway that he's trying just very slightly too hard.
Yes.
Both in the fiction and in the non-fiction.
But did you take this...
But I will say that For Whom the Bell Tolls had a titanic effect on me when I was about 14.
Titanic?
Yes, because first I'd never thought about the poetry of John Donne in quite that way.
Yeah.
You know, Joan Didion says in America when people say no man is an island, they think they're quoting Ernest Hemingway. Well, Hemingway was at least quoting John Donne.
John Donne, yeah, right.
It fascinated me in the Spanish Civil War, about which at one time I was quite an expert. I still know quite a lot about it. Yeah. I still think of it as it was the default position for people on the left. You know, there is such a thing as a just war. Not all war is bad. You don't have to be a pacifist. There are great causes worth fighting and risking your life for, dying for. Yeah. Hemingway was a tremendous introduction to that, along with Orwell's Homage to Catalonia, Robert Herrick's book, Hermanos.
Yeah. I mean, what's interesting about these memoirs is that that's part of what you say here. You tell us who's influenced you.
Yes.
You talk about friendship and influence, and I want to just not leave without talking about your mother for a second. Was she a more significant influence than your father?
Oh, much more so, because for the very cramped background that our family occupied, my father's father was a sort of very strict Baptist school teacher in a slum district in Portsmouth. No radio, no music, nothing like that. We never had any money, didn't travel much. Everything was rather austere, thrifty. That was the way I knew it. But my mother was the great exception to this. She was a great splash of color in this rather drab world. Had aspirations, was interested in fashion and beauty, was very beautiful. Tried to run a dress shop for ladies without much success, but always full of optimism. Would have liked to go up to London and go to the theatre instead of being a Navy wife, you know, on some rather grim base. So she gave me the glimpse of another world, and she also, I didn't know this, but she was all the time providing me with a second identity, and that there was a family secret, that I wasn't just a good old Anglo-Saxon son of the loam of Sussex and Hampshire. My mother's family was from Eastern Europe. My maternal ancestry was Jewish.
And
so there was this exotic element.
Did she tell you that at the time?
No, she never wanted me to know, I don't think. Well, she didn't want me to know. She might have told me if she'd lived. Yeah. I was 23 when she committed suicide.
She committed suicide with her lover in a seedy hotel in Greece.
Yes, in Athens, with a rather unsuitable lover she'd taken when her marriage to my father broke down.
I would think how hard it would be to know that she tried to reach you before she committed suicide.
Yes.